There's an old story about hot springs. Are the telephone lines haunted? It depends on who you ask. A little bit of history is in order. Years ago in the 1800s, when the telephone was new, people didn't trust electricity. They weren't real sure about it. It was a new thing in their life. In today's environment, we use cell phones, and we don't think twice about electricity. But in the life of the American citizen in the 1870s and 1880s, electricity was a very new phenomenon. The telephone was invented in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell, but it had a major flaw. He used an electromagnet. So a very famous American inventor named Thomas Edison improved his telephone by using a carbon receiver, not unlike this old telephone here. With the carbon receiver, phone quality dramatically increased. Hot Springs was a unique place in history and time in America. Many of the first inventions available in America were brought to Hot Springs. It was a place where novelty was popular. So it's with no surprise that 4 years after the telephone was invented, in the year 1880, the first telephone came to Hot Springs. And it was located on this property right here, which was the William J. Little Grocery Company. Yes, he had the telephone in his store. The line to Hot Springs was not of any particular quality. It went from Little Rock through the woods to Hot Springs. It covered trees, it went over hills, it went on rocks. In some cases, it also went on poles. And it had a unique construction in that the line itself was connected with hooks. And that's pretty important for a very particular problem that soon cropped up after the first telephone was installed. People would call Little Rock and they would swear that they would hear haunts, moans, groans, shrieks, even clapping, and music, particularly fiddle music. And this came across as a great fearful event to people in Hot Springs, keeping in mind that electricity was a phenomenon that was not quite understood. It immediately became believed that the phone line to Hot Springs was haunted, and that what people were hearing when they talked on the telephone was in fact the voices of the dead. They became absolutely convinced of this. So a lineman for Western Union Telephone Company was called to investigate this phenomenon. And what he found out was that those links of lines had soot on them from nearby fireplaces, and in some cases they had carbonized leaves. Those links had turned into almost like a microphone themselves, and they were broadcasting sounds from people nearby back into the telephone line. So the initial question about were ghosts of the dead communicating with the living seemed a little less likely as a result of this investigation. It was solved by adding more insulators along the line between Hot Springs and Little Rock. But does the question really end there? We know in 1920 that Thomas Edison announced in the very popular American magazine Scientific American that he was starting to work on a device using electromagnetism to communicate with the dead. In fact, the curiosity that began here in Hot Springs in 1880 became a lifetime fascination for Thomas Edison. It is known that when he died in the 1930s, that in the last year of his life, he was still working on a device to try to use electricity to communicate with the dead. So the Hot Springs telephone line, was it really haunted or not? You decide.